So there's an issue with the history of pottery that I feel like has not really ever been handled very nicely. And that is, how the fuck did people go from having nothing to having full blown pottery instantly? That's because apparently that's what the archaeological record indicates, right? These objects here are part of a proposal I have for how this might have actually occurred. So these objects are, so this is a pestle um, that I've actually used for grinding things. This is not fired, this is unfired clay. And these are bowls of unfired clay. And this is all actually locally sourced native clay that I just pulled out of the ground and cleaned up a little bit and formed into these balls and then let them dry out. And these are very, very strong, durable objects. Right, this is strong enough that, well, you can see that there's wear and whatever, that I've actually used it. There's there's debris on it from use, and and these you could use for things, or you could wet them. It would take a lot of water. It actually takes a lot of water to destroy something like this. But yeah, you can wet this and then turn it into anything else that you want. So I imagine objects like this were used probably for a very, very long time before fired clay became a thing, before you started getting things like, actual fired clay, like this little pot that I made, and which subsequently cracked, so I super glued it. So there's this ugly scar on it. But yeah, this one was an experiment. This is about the biggest that I can make because of the size of like the furnaces that I have. But it's extremely useful. I even, this unfired clay. What I'll do when I need more food dishes for animals, I'll just make one, let it dry out, and there you go. As long as it doesn't get wet, or like massively wet, because it actually takes a significant amount of water to damage this, to destroy this. If it's relatively thick, it takes a lot of water to destroy this. So you can't use it as a water dish, but you can use it as a food dish to store grain, to store things that you want to keep dry anyway. This is a useful material, and if it breaks, if you drop it, whatever, just pick it back up and basically glue it back together by wetting it. I imagine this is a technology that was used for a very, very long time, this sort of thing. And this also explains how sort of the first things that we see are masterfully executed. They're very, very skillfully produced objects. That makes sense if we already have experience and traditions of producing things out of clay. We just hadn't figured out that firing them makes them permanent. Temporary objects are the norm. Right? Most things that you make and use are temporary and have a life cycle and will deteriorate and become useless. So having, small objects, bowls and whatever, various sorts of tools made this way out of just dried clay that will deteriorate over time, that's not a problem. Right? That's not a deal breaker. And I actually kind of imagine like the Venus figurines that are the oldest attested pottery from about 29,000 years ago ish, up to, what is it? I think like 25, somewhere in that ballpark. They're fully formed and very well executed. I kind of wonder if what happened is there was a tradition of making them, just dried clay, and, or, objects like this. And some of them even utilitarian, possibly. And with the Venus figurines, there was part of maybe a ritual or something, not necessarily a ritual, I don't know, where it was just thrown into a fire. And thus it's preserved forever, because it actually fired the clay. But it could have actually been a used object for a long time before that, for, possibly multiple generations. Some of those could have just been dried clay before it ended up in a fire that fired it and made it accessible to archaeology. Because what's going to happen is this, if you take care of it, is not going to deteriorate from water use and from water and whatever. But if it's just left out in the field over the course of a few years, the rain and whatever is going to wash this away and turn it into nothing. And it's going to be invisible to the archaeological record. It's going to just disappear. But if you're taking care of it, then it will survive for, So I imagine that something like this probably happened, right? Because you have, like, some of the earliest pottery is coil. Like, you're making that's the least obvious way to make a pot. The most obvious way is to grab a piece of clay and start working it, and turn it into a little bowl. The least obvious way is to make a long cord and just wrap it. Even if you're basing this on weaving, on like woven baskets, that's not really how a woven basket works either. So it's still not obvious that you should do this. This definitely took some tinkering. So I feel like the production of useful clay objects, utilitarian objects like pots, predates firing of pottery, right? So you probably, and it's impossible to know how long this was going on, because if it's unfired, it's going to just deteriorate when you leave it out. When the site becomes abandoned and it's just sitting there, not only is it weaker, so it's more likely to break, but it's also going to just dissolve in the rain or in a flood, or whatever happens. It's going to just disappear into the dirt. And I don't know. I'm sure somebody's brought this up, but it's not something that I've really seen mentioned. I think I have heard somebody talk about this, but it's not something that you see very often. Generally, it's just this discussion of, oh, fired pottery, yay, and then everything goes from there. But there's definitely something that preceded this that involved skill and intent and probably generations of learning. And it was probably, I think, working with simply dried clay. Because this is a totally fine material to produce tools out of, as long as you don't necessarily need it to handle high impact or getting wet. You can make fantastic tools out of this. Fantastic little bowls, little, whatever. You make the walls thick enough. Basically, you can make a large pot. Anything that you can fire, it's gonna be dried clay first. And in the form of dried clay, right before it's ready to be fired, it's pretty durable and ready to use, really, unless you're going to be putting liquids in it.